Hello everyone and welcome to the New Normal Speaker Series. My name is Gjoko and I'm the director of the Ulman School of Design. The COVID-19 crisis has significantly widened the global wealth inequality. At the same time, while we're witnessing rising unemployment, debt, and extreme poverty, the world's richest billionaires saw their wealth increasing by 27% during the pandemic. The pandemic is also increasing poverty and inequality between wealthy countries that can afford to bail out their firms and poorer countries that do not have the capacity to do so. And this is our new normal today. My special guest is Telalbasic, a service design strategist with expert knowledge in alternative economies, complementary currencies, and entrepreneurship ecosystems. Ida also brings a unique global perspective. She was born in Bosnia, grew up in Zimbabwe, and now lives and works in London. Ida, welcome to the New Normal series.
Hi, Gjoko. Lovely to see you. Thank you for having me.
Great to see you too again. So, for a designer, your research is quite unique. It's essentially about the design of alternative economies. Can you please tell me more about your work in this area?
Sure. So my initial research in design started around the thinking of what can we do to tackle the socioeconomic crisis of 2008. So that was the former crisis, and I hope that some of the thinking I will present today will be relevant to our current pandemic and also socioeconomic crisis. I was doing my doctoral studies in Milan at the Politecnico in service design, innovation, and strategic design. And I noticed around myself, there was a lot of startups that were struggling to obtain services, struggling to keep afloat, struggling to kind of access services. So early stage entrepreneurs who basically did not have enough financial capital. And so I started to think and ask myself, well, being part of this DAAP lab, which is a research center for design for social innovation and sustainability, we were constantly preaching how design has the capacity to bring about positive change. And I started to think, well, actually, there were a lot of interesting examples about design influencing policy or design for healthcare. But why were we not designing our economies or applying this thinking to the economic systems? So my questioning started around the idea, what can service design do about the current inequality of income distribution?
That's very interesting. So can we unpack a little bit further? How would you define an alternative economy? How would you define terms such as complementary currencies and so on?
So I first started looking with the term of crisis. So in Mandarin, it's interesting that it means danger and change. So I was like thinking, well, actually, okay, let's unpack this change. And does this mean it's an also opportunity for innovation? And of course, coming from a service design research background, I also understood that I couldn't just stay within service design. I had to cut across disciplines. So I started looking at debt and credit systems. And of course, being trained as a designer, this was quite complex and challenging because I was like having to dive deeper into understanding credit systems and alternative ways of exchange. What also helped me was applying systems thinking, understanding a bit deeper on what we mean by the knowledge economy in which we are currently now. Of course, we're living in a service economy and a digital economy as well. And also it was interesting, behavioral economics and complementary currencies, as you've said. And so what I started to understand, to look at was, well, what is the role of design in co-designing a new currency system? So if we are struggling with financial capital, can design actually co-create a new currency to meet the needs of social entrepreneurs? And so what I looked at as well was collaborative services, which is basically when you design services that include the final users in the process, and they become both the service co-designers and co-producers. And of course, this adds to the co-created value that services create.
Interesting. Essentially, when we discuss about these things, we are talking about a resilience in a state of crisis. And currently, we're experiencing at least 3 different crises at the same time. We have a health crisis, social crisis, and an economic crisis. How can we build resilience in a state of crisis?
So one of the things that I came across was this complementary currency system, which I didn't really know much about. And it was quite coincidental because I was looking at exploring opportunities to work with the Impact Hub in Milan. And it was thanks to the then director, Alberto Massetti Zanini, who introduced me to Sardex, which was a really successful business B2B mutual credit system at the time in Sardinia. And what it did was it helped businesses stay afloat during the 2008 crisis. And I would like to mention the Veer Bank, which is one of the most successful complementary currencies in the world. And the reason is it comes from Switzerland. And what it did was it was founded right after the Great Depression, so between the two world wars. And what it did was it was trying to inject additional capital in order to keep money circulating within the economy through continued exchange of goods and services. And what it did was that it functioned in parallel to the Swiss franc. So when there's an economic crisis, the Veer currency increases in circulation. And when the economy is booming, the Swiss franc increases again. But the really interesting thing was that it was having these two currencies in parallel that really helped keep businesses afloat. And if we're to look at what a complementary currency is, if I look at one definition, it's definitely by one of the most well-known authors on the topic, Bernard Lietaer, who was also responsible for designing the euro long back. It's basically an agreement to use something else than tender, so our national money, as a medium of exchange with the purpose to link unmet needs with otherwise unused resources. And that's really interesting because here we're looking at the concept of idle capacity. So how can, we're living in a knowledge economy. It means that if we don't have capital to exchange services to develop our businesses, but we all have knowledge. So how can we capitalize this knowledge in a certain circuit with certain governing rules in order to support those people who are concerned, in this case, early stage entrepreneurs. And some of the things that I think are really interesting as well to mention here is that this type of thinking comes from systemic biomimicry, so imitating natural systems. And if I take an example, for example, as one example of a panda who eats only one type of food, of course, the resilience of the panda is very low because he or she, well, it relies on only one type of food, right? Or if we ask ourselves, why do we have two kidneys? It is if one kidney fails, we can still survive with the other one. So this is nature's way of creating resilience by providing parallel systems or parallel capital or resources. And so this is one way in which, if we translate this thinking into the monetary system, diversity ensures more resilience. So complementary currencies don't aim to substitute. They don't want to be to replace our current monetary systems. We very much, of course, need them, and they are a legal agreement that we all believe and trust in. But I definitely think, at least from my research, that they do provide an alternative means. And I think in crises like the ones we have witnessed in 2008 and also now, I think this type of thinking can really be interesting in structurally diversifying the medium of exchange. So adding additional ways in which we can exchange services or skills or capacities and so on.
This is very interesting. I actually find the complementary currency systems quite fascinating as a topic. There are two of these systems that I'm particularly impressed by. The microfinancing model developed by the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh and the Torex social currency that was introduced in Belgium. Can you perhaps talk a little bit more about these two models?
Sure. So apart from looking at the different theoretical prisms in understanding, of course, this was all very new for me as well. So I developed a collection of case studies from both emerging economies and the Western world. And what I found was, of course, the rules that govern the different contexts is very different. So the kind of motivations and interests in initiating these kind of systems is very different, as well as the benefit that they bring. So the Grameen that you mentioned, of course, is a famous example, and it comes from Bangladesh, and it was founded by Professor Muhammad Yunus, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for this microcredit system. And I would like to add, I had the honor of meeting him at his book launch in London, which was also really fascinating, and really tell him how he inspired my work in many different ways. And what this did, it was his idea was basically, you know, in a lot of these emerging countries or contexts from the global south, especially, poor people don't have access to any kind of banking services. So he started to think, well, how can we provide credit to the poor, who are usually completely excluded financially in this sense? And what he developed was giving microloans at favorable conditions to small groups of people who were primarily women. And so each borough belongs to a small solidarity group, and he or she is responsible for repaying their own loan. And of course, the members are not responsible for paying each other's loans, but if someone defaults in that system, then that group doesn't get more loans to the entire group. So there's a certain kind of social pressure at play for the whole group, where members then often will help each other towards reaching that goal. And this term is coined as solidarity lending. And what is interesting is that the members within the small group actually act as co-guarantors of repayment.
And the Torex, that is also a very fascinating model from Belgium.
Yeah, so this being from Belgium, a European country, and this was interesting. So compared
it's a
to
stark contrast, because Bangladesh being a developing country and Belgium being a developed country, but both utilizing complementary currencies.
Exactly. So it's interesting that Grameen was founded by an individual, whereas Torekis was basically initiated by the government.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is really interesting to stress here, because with complementary currencies, some governments will see these systems as a threat to the fiat currency being the national currency. And with the case of Torekis, the government was keen to support and create this currency because there was a very poor neighborhood in Ghent, in the city of Ghent, and a large immigrant population was basically living in very small apartment blocks, and their dream was to have some kind of land to do some gardening. And the Torekis currency, when it was developed, it enabled these immigrants to earn Torekis by, for example, planting window boxes on facades, collecting litter, so doing very positive community betterment initiatives. And what happened was the government then rented out small plots of land for these people to basically do gardening and use them for growing food. And these small rents were paid also in Torekis. So, and of course, another thing I want to add is, of course, with Torekis, they were allowed to go to specialized supermarkets or buy cinema tickets at discounted rates. So it was really interesting because the amount of money that this cost for the government was tripled in terms of the benefit, in terms of what was done. So the neighborhoods were clean, they had flowers, the communities were growing their own food, and the system allowed this really interesting circulation of benefit to be focusing in making that part of the city better. And I think this is an example where a complementary currency can bring about behavioral change through reward.
Yeah, I really like how they managed to transform that community and to create a microeconomy within the community, because they also they use the same system and currency to create some new job opportunities. So there will be Torekis Cafe, where you will there were people employed there. You can buy food that was locally grown. You will buy products and stuff that are locally made by the people there in Torex currency. You could also use social public services like bus. You can buy bus tickets and so on with that currency. So it was really interesting how such a small thing in a way created such a significant social change. And in terms of, if you look at it as a design of social innovation, that is probably one of the most amazing examples that I have come across in terms of how that actually managed to help an entire community. The Grameen Bank in Bangladesh was also a fascinating example. And yes, in that part of the world, there is a significant need for the poor population, for the socially, economically disadvantaged communities to have access to funds. And sometimes this has been abused. One actually similar, but in exactly the opposite way, negative example was what Roy Subarta did with Sahara in India, where looking at the same similar model, it was micro savings and so on from the poorest people in India, he managed to accumulate a giant wealth for himself, but reformulating this whole model as a pyramid scheme where the poorest people lost even the tiniest savings that they actually had. So, it's this always leaves this opportunity. The system can be abused if it's unregulated in some way. So
yes,
this is.
I think I would like to add, I think trust plays a huge part in this. And I think during my research, I always kind of stumbled upon this question on how much do you want to scale these type of models? And I think trust plays a huge part because, as we saw with Grameen, it relies on ties between people in these groups. And of course, social pressure in this case helps in making sure that people do repay these loans. But I think the danger is that if these systems or service models grow too big, then the trust is lost, and then people can start abusing and misusing the system in many different ways. But I think what you've pointed out here is that we can see how they provide strategies to resist financial inclusions. And what is interesting, I think, is that they challenge the way money is both managed and produced by states and banks. And of course, this is not to be rebellious, but it's just to say, obviously, one of the reasons I saw that they come to exist is because people don't have trust in local authorities. So they start these localized circuits or networks in order to provide individual empowerment or enhance collaboration between people in that community, or using existing local resources. And I think where it becomes about building stronger community ties and capacity building, this is what I found really interesting with the early stage entrepreneurs, because they use these kind of systems as a way to both create their reputation by exchanging and building their reputation currency, as well as getting in touch with other people within the network. So this collaborative mindset very much relates to the fact, if I'm part of a network, I can benefit from the N number of people within that network. So it's a really interesting systemic thinking, I think, which can hopefully provide some inspiration for people to design their own localized systems as such.
Actually, the business community can learn a great deal from some of these social innovations. I mean, if you unpack them and if you break them down, you will see that those successful models have they're very entrepreneurial, and they have this great bones on which you can actually build business, a business strategy, and a business plan. And actually, Grameen does that in some ways. For example, they're not about micro lending, they're about microfinancing, which is the difference between the two models, because micro lending is just giving money for small interest and just circulating money in that way. But microfinancing provides an entire financial service to the community. So it provides insurance, it provides lending, it provides business advice and business development opportunities and so on. And if you see in this particular case, everybody wins. It's you can actually grow business. And the way that some of these things are connected as ecosystems, like in let's say in Belgium, it lends, one thing supports another business. They lend to each other the support that they all need to grow. And this is very interesting, especially from a perspective of looking entrepreneurship ecosystems, which is, again, it's another area that you specialize in. How do you connect these two things?
So when you were saying about Grameen, I think what is interesting is that one of the things I found in the case studies was that some of these models are basically built B2B, so supporting businesses, as I gave the example with Sardex in Sardinia, whereas, for example, time banks will usually be between individuals who are trying to use and exchange time for getting certain errands done or whatever. And I think this is again where we see these distributed, decentralized and democratized models coming to play, which I think is really interesting. And of course, we can't not talk about Bitcoin, or at least mention it, because I think this is one example of a decentralized system. And I think this is where the threat of not being able to control these kind of systems comes into play. But I personally am not a huge fan of Bitcoin, because the way it encourages people to use huge amounts of electric energy to mine coins through mathematical algorithms is not really doing much for our societies or improving our ecologies or environment in any way. So I think it's definitely an interesting example of a decentralized system, but I think this kind of thinking can definitely be applied to more social and better means.
As we discussed about use and abuse of currencies, Bitcoin and other similar currencies have often been abused, actually. You know, so do you want to reflect on some of those aspects?
I think Bitcoin is one that comes to mind where this kind of misuse is definitely prevalent. However, another thing that I found in my research is this question of convertibility. So do you want to allow that people can basically convert back into a fiat currency, a certain complementary currency, which in itself can be a voucher scheme or time credits or frequent flyer points. These are all different models that we're quite familiar with. And the question of convertibility brings about other issues, both legal and both whether these systems are misused. Because even when I was co-designing my service model, one of the things I had to keep in mind was, do I want people to kind of enter the system, access the services that are available from the people who can offer them, and then exit? And this is a real risk with these kind of systems, because you have to take care of how do you ensure that people will be motivated to be part of them, but at the same time ensuring that people don't misuse them by going in, accessing, and then not being able to kind of pay back by providing other services to others in the network.
So what can service design do in times of economic transformation, such as the one that we are witnessing today?
So I think one of the things that I would definitely like to underline is that service design in itself is a multidisciplinary discipline. I think we work with ethnographers and engineers and economists and sociologists. And I think this is what makes this discipline so exciting, and definitely exciting for me. And I think one of the key points is going outside of the discipline. So I think one of the things that I found challenging was going into the topic of economics. But it definitely provided a foundation in understanding both the economic crisis and also looking historically at how we have dealt with other financial crises in the past. And I think service design has the ability to enable interactions to happen. So we can't design experiences, but we can design the condition for certain experiences to take place. And we can basically create ways in which we can design interactions between people and technology, people and business models, and then larger communities and systems within larger ecosystems. And I think design has the capacity to really apply participatory design tools, methods, and approaches. And my research was also included a participatory design action research approach. And what that meant was I basically developed a methodology in which I tried to co-design the new service model with entrepreneurs. And I also co-designed the new tools to use in those kind of sessions where we were trying to really go deeper in understanding, well, how would this currency work? How would you enter? How would you build your reputation? What would the exit strategy be? What would the different valuation schemes be? How would you actually be able to convert or not convert time, credits, money, in order to benefit early stage entrepreneurs in developing their services? So I think I don't like to preach that design has the solution for everything, but I definitely do think that this kind of thinking can be useful in going off and designing your own complementary currency system. Why not? So I think it gives you the tools, the methods, and the way, the approach, the mindset, I think, most of all, in thinking systemically and looking at how can we now address this current pandemic and current crisis using this kind of thinking, because this crisis is not new. There has been many crises and crashes, bank crashes and sovereign debts throughout history, and actually very often, you know, it's not something that happens every 20 years, but actually happens quite often. So I think what I would like to really say or stress is that I think resilient strategies, companies need to think about creating resilient strategies from within in order to be prepared for something similar happening in the future. It is how we deal with shock that basically determines whether we survive or not. And I think complementary currencies, or at least, you know, taking that as a starting point and then designing it according to the context, according to the needs of the communities of the people we're designing for, can definitely have a huge impact and a huge possibility.
Ida, that is fascinating. I really enjoyed having this conversation. I do think that it is certainly that the time is certainly ripe for introducing some new models and looking at how we can change the world in a more positive way. And there is no better time than a crisis to actually do that. So thank you so much for your time today. It's always great talking with you.
Thank you so much, Gjoko, for inviting me.
Thank you for being my guest.